So hello and welcome to Update on Food Safety Rules for Small Producers and Co-ops with Roger Noonan and Suzette Snow-Cobb at NOFA New Hampshire's 20th Annual Winter Conference. I'm Laura Angers, NOFA New Hampshire's Program Coordinator, and I'll be hosting this session with Nikki Kolb, NOFA New Hampshire's Operations Manager. First, please note that we're recording this session and all sessions throughout the conference. Some of those recordings are available on the workshop links page, and we're adding them throughout the week. Everyone will be muted, or no, we changed our minds. We will allow you to unmute during the workshop to have more of a discussion, but please also feel free to type your questions into the chat box throughout the discussion. And for technical issues, please feel free to communicate publicly through the chat or message me or Nikki directly and privately. If you'd like to access closed captioning, click on the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, click the arrow on the CC icon, and then click Show Subtitle. And then if you're watching on a smaller screen, it might look a little different. So click the three dots at the bottom of your Zoom screen that read More, and then click the Show Subtitle option. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on the land of the Pennacook tribe, or Ndakina, the Abenaki word for the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. And we acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Alnobak, or people who have stewarded this land through the generations. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Roger Noonan of Middle Branch Farm and president of the New England Farmers Union, and Suzette Snow-Cobb of the neighboring Food Co-op Association and the New England Farmers Union.
Good morning. Thank you, Laura, and welcome everybody. So I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation and we will rip through that. I would encourage folks to raise their hand, the little function down below, and chime in through the chat box. But I'd also like to start off by asking you all what kind of farming you're doing and what brings you to this. So I'm going to just go down the list on my side and start with the names I see. And the first one I see is Julie Lusigan. Pardon if I'm sorry if I'm butchering that.
Hi, Roger. We are a small regenerative organic farm in Bradford, New Hampshire. So we're growing vegetables. There's no animals here. Mainly, it's an intensive farming sort of system.
Yep.
Yeah, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm going to ask one more specific question. What's your water source for your vegetable production?
Yeah, it's changed recently. We just got a drilled well put in at the end of last year, so we're really excited about that.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. And the next one I see is Yulia Rothenberg.
Hi. I'm here. I'm a member of the Seacoast Permaculture Group, and I'm here listening to everyone's workshops to learn more about the farming systems. I don't have a farm, but I'm a consumer who's really conscientious about where I buy my food and whom I support, and my interest in this to create a more connected local food system in the Seacoast area and in New England in general.
Awesome. Well, we've just got more people in here, and now it's screwed up my the order. Megan. And we'll go over to Jean Jonas. There's somebody I know. Jean, want to tell us about your farm?
Hey, how's everyone doing? Yeah, we're a vegetable farm, basically. We grow to organic standards and we sell through our CSA. We're down in Mason. The name of the farm is Hungry Bear Farm. And we've been at it for 12 years.
Jean, what do you use for a water source for your vegetable production?
Yeah, Yeah, there's a well on the property.
Jess, this is probably going to take longer than I reckoned. Um, So I guess why don't you all just so we don't use up all the time with intros, why don't you just, if you want to throw in the chat box, if you're a farm, even if you're not a farm, you're just gardening, what's your water source? Because that's going to be, even though the PowerPoint's going to go through a lot of other stuff, the real crux of this is the new changes to the water rule. So with that, I think I'll start with this presentation, and we're focused on qualified exempt producers. If there is anyone here that is producing over $500,000 worth of food, whether it's animal feed or human food, then you would be fully covered under the rule. And I would be welcome to email me or Suzette, and we'll get you additional information. This is really focused on what most of us are, is small farmers and very small farmers, and not covered by the rule. So with the next slide, please. Is it Nikki or who's running this slide? Okay. So we're here under an FDA cooperative agreement through the, we call it the Local Food Safety Collaborative. It's part of it's a subset of the National Farmers Union Foundation. I think we were in our last year of funding, and the mission is to provide education, outreach, and training to small local food producers and processors on the produce safety rule and the preventive controls rule of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Those sectors of agriculture have sort of been somewhat left out in the education and outreach that FDA is doing with the covered farms, and they've contracted with the states to implement and regulate the Food Safety Modernization Act, and the funds there that they've dedicated there are targeted at the covered farms. And that left a whole bunch of us that weren't necessarily covered, maybe a little shy on resources. And we wanted to make sure that we were getting that feedback loop, because even if you are exempt, ultimately, next slide, please. Ultimately, you are not exempt from providing safe food to your customers, nor would you want to be, right? So FSMA, as we call it, is a mandatory food safety law passed in 2011. It's the first major update to the federal food code since 1938, and that was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It establishes science-based minimum standards for produce handling on farms. It applies a preventive approach to ensuring food safety and uses systems-based thinking to provide adaptability rules for a wide range of businesses. It's implemented in 7 different parts. The produce safety rule is the part affecting farms. The preventive controls rule is the part that affects the processing side. And some farms are both producers and processors. If you can, for yourself or your customers, or do any of these, low acid canning, you're processing. And if you're doing it to a higher level, like our sponsor Stonyfield of this thing, then you're in a whole different world of regulatory requirements. And so even those of us that are very small and operating under, say, the cottage, the homestead food production statute in New Hampshire, that would be basically the same thing you would apply for FSMA. You would say, I'm exempt, I'm following this state regulation, and therefore you wouldn't have to worry about registering as a facility. And so what FSMA does, which is what's dramatically different, is it's shifting the focus to preventing contamination of the food supply rather than responding to it. It applies to human food as well as to food for animals, that's livestock and pets. Next slide, please.
There was a question in the chat. What was the threshold that would qualify or not qualify? Would be exempt?
500,000. Well, there's a $25,000 exception. So if you're below $25,000 in produce sales, you're exempt. And if you're below $500,000 in all food sales and you sell within 275 miles of your farm, you have what's called a qualified exemption. And I'll explain those in greater detail later in the presentation.
Roger,
Yes.
There's a little bit of background noise. I think that your microphone might be hitting your shirt.
Oh, let me
Is there a way you can?
see if this little clip helps. How's
Okay,
that?
perfect. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thanks. That's what I get for falling asleep at night with these things in. All right, so let me move this chat box out of my way here. The produce safety rule is based on customer health and produce safety fundamentals. These are things that we all know these things, and these are just sort of spelled out in some regulatory language. But microbiological pathogens can make people sick. I think we're all aware of that. Pathogens are more likely to make vulnerable people sick, including the young, the elderly, pregnant, and the immunocompromised. And we've certainly learned that lesson over the last couple of years with COVID. The pathogens are commonly found in animal and human feces. We all know that. Pathogens most commonly contaminate food via people. Failure to wash your hands or improper handling of food is a big one, and water. And of course, our food contact services, including our equipment. Biological soil amendments, which under FSMA, we call them biological soil amendments with animal origin. That includes any post-consumer vegetative waste. So if you're using compost and say you've harvested a bunch of lettuce, it doesn't, you take it to market, it comes back, you throw it in the compost heap. That's not post-consumer. Let's say you've cleaned off your dinner plate and your 2-year-old didn't eat their spinach and you throw it in the compost bin. That is post-consumer vegetative waste. It's been contaminated, right, by human hands, human mouth. Animal manures and byproducts, that includes blood meals, feather meals, bone meals. There are, specific requirements that if they're appropriately heat treated, as most of those products are, then they would not be considered a biological soil animal origin. And compost made from any of those products. Many of the PSR requirements are just common sense hygiene practices, such as washing your hands after using the bathroom, properly cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, keeping animals away from production areas, and using water that is safe for its intended use. Next slide, please. The National Organic Program, and I'm not sure, I know, Gene, you follow organic practices, but there is, for anyone that's certified organic, we have very specific records that we need to keep required. And the reason I point this out is that the FSMA statute, the actual law passed by Congress, said that nothing within FSMA could conflict with the National Organic Program. And we find a lot of synergies between the two programs. They both are rather record intensive. So the National Organic Programs authorized under the Organic Foods Production Act in 1990. Senator Leahy, next door in Vermont, was primary architect, along with a former Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Kathleen Merrigan, who's worked for Senator Leahy for a number of years. It establishes the minimum standards for organic production, handling, and marketing in the U.S. It requires a third-party certification of compliance with the organic regulations. And here in New Hampshire, we have the Department of Ag, and I think there are other out-of-state certifiers one can use as well. There is a micro exemption from certification available to producers selling under 5,000 annually. And if you are above that threshold, you're still subject to inspection, even if you're not certified, if you're using the term organic. Next slide, please. Underlying principles of the National Organic Program are based on environmental sustainability and stewardship of resources. Production practices should foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, conserve biodiversity. Farming systems are explicitly committed to the place by the land history, the crop rotations, and the site-specific solutions. Practices integrate cultural, biological, and mechanical practices and use of chemical solutions as a last resort. Organic farming cannot use prohibited synthetic chemicals, and genetic engineering is not allowed in seed, animal feed, or propagation stock. Next slide, please. So are you exempt from the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act? Do you grow food crops? Are you a grower or processor of food crops? Are you only a processor? These are all the elements one would consider. By the sounds of it, just the data says the vast majority of us are not covered by the rule. But one of the things, like I said, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act puts a legal liability on us to deliver unadulterated food to our customers. So if you're in commercial production, that's the bottom line. And what FSMA is, all the FSMA rules, the 7 FSMA rules, they represent the minimum standards. And there are higher standards of food safety that some big producers, certain markets will require global gap and SQFI. There's a whole host of different things, even down to sort of USDA gap on a single item, field pack kale or something like that, that can get you market access to, Shaw's or Whole Foods or larger places beyond one of our local food co-ops. Next slide, please. So subject to the produce safety rule, if you produce less than $25,000 in produce sales over a 3-year average, you are not covered under the produce safety rule. You're excluded. Again, you're not excluded. If you make somebody sick and it's traced back to your farm, you could be liable. And then of course there's just sort of a civil liability, even if the FDA didn't proceed with criminal liability. It is a criminal offense to make somebody sick with your food. A very small business is defined as between 25,000 but less than 250,000 in annual food sales. Small business is 250 to under $500,000, and a large business is over $500,000 in annual sales. This is broadly addressing the produce safety rule. There are, next slide will have the qualified exemptions. Next slide, please. Produce means any fruit or vegetable, including mixes of intact fruits and vegetables, and includes mushrooms. Sprouts are also included as produce, peanuts, tree nuts, and herbs. Produce that is used for personal or on-farm consumption is excluded. So if you are, say, running an Airbnb or agritourism operation and you're growing food and it's for that on-farm consumption, it's excluded from your number, so to speak. Next slide, please. There is exclusions for rarely consumed raw foods, and this is the exhaustive list of items that are not covered. There's probably, I'm sure a lot of you can look at that list and say, boy, I eat a lot of those raw. Some people probably eat most of them raw. But these are foods that have rarely consumed raw, very relatively low risk from a food safety point of view. So if you're growing only those crops, you're not covered by, you ostensibly not covered by the produce safety rule. It's not covered produce. Next slide, please. Are you qualified exempt? So food sales averaging less than $500,000 during the previous 3 years adjusted for inflation. I tried to get the latest adjusted for inflation. There's a slide later on, an older slide that's from 2017, I think, or 2016. So the numbers have increased over time along with inflation, though currently with our 7.1% inflation, I'm not sure that they're adequately reflecting that. What a qualified end user is directly to the consumer. And that consumer can be an individual, it can be a restaurant, it can be a direct to the store, it can be to a warehouse that supplies a number of stores. It can't be to a wholesaler who then goes and resells to some other entity. And let's see. And of course, within 275 miles from the farm. And this is what we call the Tester-Hagen exemption amendment. This is something that we fought for in that run up to FSMA to make sure that small farms weren't regulated out of business and had the flexibility. Next slide, please. So qualified exempt farms must meet certain modified requirements. So if you're I'll say I'm at the farmer's market and I've got some of Jean's lettuce or something, I'm short on lettuce. I bought some lettuce from Jean. I should have a sign that says at the point of sale, that this comes from Hungry Bear Farm in Mason. That would be the extent of it. We have a multi-farm cooperative CSA, local harvest CSA in Concord. Identifying where the individual produce comes from is one of the requirements for us. Next slide, please. This is, there are exemptions also for produce that gets commercial processing. Probably doesn't apply here, but let's say somebody was just raising tomatoes for processing, then they are going to have that kill step. So you would be exempt from having to comply with the produce safety rule, because what you're producing, any hazards that are picked up there are going to be taken care of in a kill step. Pasteurized cider might be another example. Next slide, please. Proving eligibility for the qualified exemption. This is not necessarily written in stone. This is just, we don't really know what anyone's requiring. I would say this is probably good enough for the state of New Hampshire. 3 years of sales records, and whether you're getting that number from, I don't know, is it line 2 or 3 on a Schedule F or whatever it is, however you track your sales, whatever document you have to back up those gross sales, add them up, average it over the 3 years, and like I said, the vast majority of farms, I think we have 30 farms maybe in the state that are covered. So the vast majority of us, even nationwide, are probably operating under qualified exemption. Next slide, please. So like I said, this was a little dated, but you can see how fast I think this was using a 3% inflation rate. And I believe the FDA has this on their website as well. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into any of the other modified requirements because we haven't seen the guidance, which is once Congress passes a law, the agency through the administrative rules process creates a proposed regulation, becomes a final regulation, and then they create guidance documents that get more down to the nitty-gritty of what their interpretation of what Congress intended, how that's actually going to play out on the ground. We're still waiting for more information on that guidance document. There is a draft guidance document out there. Next slide, please. Okay, so we do have records requirements. This is for all farms, covered farms. When you have a record, the name and location of the farm, and any of you that are certified organic are familiar with keeping records. I'm going to just pause here if there's any questions, because I don't necessarily see anyone raising their hands, but if anyone's got any questions up to this point, feel free to raise your hand and I'll address it. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next slide. Records must be kept for 2 years. Even though you're operating under modified requirements, here are sort of the big ones, right? Worker health and hygiene, hand washing, cleaning, cleaning up after yourselves, not eating where you're packing out your produce. There's probably a lot of things that we do as small farms that are, I mean, if any of you folks get, what is it, Growing for Market magazine? I mean, sometimes I see things there, and especially on their social media, that have me scratching my head as somebody that, is a food safety professional. I say any of you that are farmers are food safety professionals, whether you know it or not. I mean, you are. We're the first line of defense, right? So, and I see, dogs in fields, and, I've been guilty of that too. But as you learn about the hazards, I think we have to just become more in tune and sort of develop, whereas organic farmers, we already have a very, environmentally minded and socially responsible minded approach to our farming practices. We also have to incorporate this public health standard. And I think just including that as part of your rationale and looking at the farm and your systems and your practices and how you can improve your on-farm food safety probably makes you a better farmer, and certainly would be appreciated by your customers as well. I just want to briefly just highlight a couple of things in these things, like hand washing. Number one, if we just institute more hand washing, between things, I've been pulling beets out of the ground. My hands are dirty. Now I'm going to go harvest the lettuce. If you have a simple hand washing station, which can be a an igloo water jug, over a sink with some disposable paper towels and a bucket to catch the wastewater, not near your food production area, and just, wash your hands. Sanitizer doesn't cut it. You can certainly use it as adjunct. Biological soil amendments. If you are using animal manures and compost, the current recommendation is that you follow the NOP requirements, which are 180 days if it touches the edible portion of the crop and 90 days if it doesn't. Compost has, I think, a 45-day under the NOP. But I can't think of too many times when you really need to be applying a compost or manure, that close to harvest anyway. Ag water is we'll talk first about the production water. That is what you're using to irrigate your crops. And a couple of things, like on my farm, we have 3 water sources. I have a pond, a river I pump out of, and we have I guess we have 4. We have an artesian well with our potable water that we use for our packing house and our house itself. And we have a dug well that services some greenhouses. Of all those water sources, I would never use, except for the potable water, on a foliar irrigation, right? Overhead irrigation that would contact the crop anytime within, a few days of harvest. I may use overhead from the pond to, did I say, yep, you, Sue, thank you, I stand corrected, thank you. I just see Sue pointing, it's 9120, not 9180, thank you. So, I may use water that's a little murky or questionable quality for, say, you've just seeded some crops and you're using it to, get the crop going, dry soil conditions, but a long way from harvest, right? And post-harvest water should always be potable water. If you're washing your produce, make sure it's potable water. Equipment, tools, and buildings. I think the big thing there that we should think about is if we have animals and you've got a shovel you're mucking out the chicken house with, or a pig pen, you're not taking that same shovel down to, say, I don't know, using it in a situation where you may get cross-contamination, right? Post-harvest handling, clean containers that you can wash, not having them touch the ground, and also understanding the things of cleaning and sanitation. Cleaning is wipe away the dirt, wash it with some soap and hot water, and sanitizing is then using, if you're an organic farmer, you can use chlorine products, and there's some oxidate and some other hydrogen peroxide based products you can use as well. And of course, record keeping. Next slide, please. Oh, and a note on the farm food safety plan is not required, but your organic system plan, if you're a certified organic farmer, you're familiar with that term, you could incorporate into your organic system plan many of the things that would be part of your food safety plan. And there are resources that we'll share later for development of an on-farm food safety plan. Next slide, please. Regulation compliance dates, really don't need to worry about it here. This is for covered operations. Next slide, please. So do you have to register your farm operation with the FDA? That's under what they call the Bioterrorism Act. I think that goes back to, I don't know, early 2000s, I think, when that came out. For instance, we have a maple sugar house, and we registered under the Bioterrorism Act, under what at the time the state of New Hampshire called the voluntary maple registration, but it was to conform with the Bioterrorism Act. It's unlikely that you do, but if you have questions about it, feel free to reach out and we can talk about your specific circumstance. Next slide, please. So if your farm meets the FDA definition of a farm, we should talk about what a farm is. As defined by the FDA, an operation under one management and one general but not necessarily contiguous physical location devoted to the growing, harvesting of crops, raising of animals, including seafood, or any combination of these activities. If you're a farm, you're exempt from registration and you're exempt from the PC rule. Next, that's the preventive controls rule. Next slide, please. Now, what if you're a secondary activities farm? And that's an operation not located on a primary production farm that harvests, such as hulling or shelling, packs, and or holds raw agricultural commodities, euphemistically called racks. This definition only applies if the primary production farm that grows, harvests, and or raises the majority of the raw agriculture commodities owns or jointly owns a majority interest in the secondary activity farm. That is a mouthful, but basically it says if you're a farmer-owned co-op, then you're a secondary activities farm. Now, if you're this is where we get into some gray areas. If you say you're a food hub, and your food hub is perhaps a nonprofit entity, it's not owned by farmers, and it's doing some value-added work or some of these other things. Is it a facility? It's no longer a farm. If it's a cooperative, then this is one of the things that we fought for with the Farmers Union, because cooperatives are such an important part, we believe, of the local and regional food economy. Next slide, please. There is also an exemption for retail food establishments. So certain farm operations are retail food establishments. I mean, there's a lot of farm stands that are more grocery store than farm operation. They're not subject to registration, and they're not subject to parental controls. Sometimes they're subject to more local regulation because they've got a commercial kitchen or a restaurant or something like that. So the BTA exempts, that's Bioterrorism Act, exempts retail food establishments from registration. And if your farm and food business meets that definition, you're also not required. Next slide, please. I think I already covered that. We'll skip over. So if you do farm activities, but also manufacture and process, and we've been told in the ag game here in the Northeast for years that we need to get into value added and different things, because we can't grow corn and soybeans and have massive feedlots to be successful farmers like our Midwest colleagues. So we have to do value added. And then you become a farm mix type facility. This is where it gets much more confusing from a regulatory standpoint. Again, fortunately or unfortunately, we're all rather very small, and typically the things that we might do are going to fall under, I think the homestead exemption in New Hampshire is at $25,000 now, and I think there's a proposal to bring it up to $35,000. And if you can operate under those exemptions, which would cover you under FSMA, the parental controls rule, just being in compliance with a state exempt program. And you get above that, well, seek professional help. And if you have a special case, your own farm, you have questions, feel free to reach out, because these things are very, like all things relative to land and agriculture, they're very specific to the land, to your type of operation. So there's a lot of things that we need to know to sort of point you in the right direction. Next slide, please. I'm gonna skip over this stuff on the preventive controls requirements. Next slide, please. So again, low risk, we know what those things are. You can use this link, they spell it all out. But again, unless you're doing a really high volume on a high risk product, if you're operating within the state of New Hampshire's homestead exemption, you're not going to run afoul of the preventive controls rule and FDA, unless you make somebody sick. And then in that case, hopefully you've followed best practices, industry standard practices to the best of your ability. And that doesn't mean you have to have a laboratory environment. It just means you have to, show that you are thorough and thoughtful in your approach, and you're following the generally accepted practices. Next slide, please. Okay, so looks like I forgot to get a couple of slides in there. So what I want to talk about right now is the new water rule and the approach that FDA is taking. So original rule had a metric, a standard that was very, very complicated. And what they have done now is release that rule. And there is a presentation at the top of the chat. I think well, there's the rule. And it's a risk-based approach. And so what you would do is to determine if the water is safe for its intended use. You'd take a look at, we can close this now. You take a look at your water source, right? And I think there's 4 key elements. Let's assume that, is anyone not exempt from the rule? Is anyone here farming over $500,000 worth of produce and, selling to Whole Foods or, I didn't think so, okay. But let's just consider as in terms of how we approach our farm water. Most of you seem to be using wells. So if your well's tested, and you should, even though the FDA is not proposing that we have to do any testing, you want to know where your water's at, right? I've talked to a lot of folks that have found out they were, even in their wells, they had high arsenic levels. That they find out things about their water that they didn't know. So getting your water tested, there's an outfit, Nelson Analytics, right here in New Hampshire, across the Northeast, a great outfit. I think for get a generic E. coli test. If you have an artesian well, I mean, you can just sort of ask for that full, I forget what they call it, but there's like the same kind of test if you're going to sell your house, make sure that there's, Andy can tell you what it is when you call Nelson Analytics. The other thing they have, if you're using water, and again, the principal part of the rule is water that's safe for its intended use. So like I said, on my farm, I may use my pond water or river water for certain crops at certain times. But it wouldn't be just before harvest. Now, there are some times when maybe, we've got a real hot spell, it's been very dry. If I don't get some water on those leafy greens, they're gonna look like crap and I can't market them, right? So I may need to put, some wobblers, turn some wobblers on. If I'm going to do that, I'm going to, in the case of my farm, I have a completely different plumbing system that runs the potable water to do just that on certain crops. But like on my field crops of pumpkins and squash, they're on drip anyway. So if you're using drip irrigation, you've taken a mitigation approach there, right? And does everyone know what drip irrigation is? Trickle irrigation? It's plastic tubing. It can be on the surface. It can be below the surface. And the emitters are spaced anywhere from 6 to, I think, up to 18 inches. And it'll put that water right, at the root zone. It's a very efficient system. We use it for most of our crops. Again, there are those leafy greens where they need overhead. Another thing you can consider is a log die-off. And log die-off, and I'm no microbiologist, but basically it's 10 times decrease in the pathogen loading per day. So the FDA has said in this new proposed water rule, you are exempt from this new rule if you don't irrigate 4 days prior to. So a 4-day, a 4 log die-off. So you can shut the water off 4 days before. Now they're not saying you should use horrible water right out of a manure lagoon or anything like that, but they recognize that, and this is a proposed rule. So it could change as people go back and forth on what they feel is reasonable. So that's an important, I think an important thing for us to realize is, we do have this log die-off, and just like anyone that sprays chemicals, even organic OMRI approved pesticides have a restricted entry interval. They have a time to harvest. So even if your water is not pristine, you can apply that water knowing that maybe it's a crop that's not going to be an issue. Like I'm spraying it on potatoes while they're under the ground. I'm spraying on carrots. I'm spraying on seedlings that have just started, and it's going to be a long time before we get to a problem. The other thing you want to consider is the crop characteristics. We know certain crops have a high incident foodborne illness, right? From green onions to spinach and leafy greens, and melons, cantaloupes in particular, with their netting and cracks and stuff like that. Those are very common to have issues. We also know that most of the issues originate in very large farms in California. And that's twofold. One, there's a lot of agriculture there, right? So you have a lot of animal agriculture and you've got a lot of vegetable production. So knowing where your farm is relative to other activities around your farm. Our biggest concern around here is probably irresponsible. I mean, I don't want to be too site specific, but let's just say there's somebody that has a few horses and they're just throwing the manure over a bank into a wetland, and that wetland drains into a stream that drains into your pond. You have no control over what they do other than to, call Department of Ag and, start the complaint process. But the control you have on your side is, I'm not going to use that water for certain things, or I'm going to use that water in a particular manner that minimizes the risk. One thing I preach on any regulation is comply by avoiding the hazards that put you in. There'll be there's a lot of focus on using chemicals to treat really crappy water. I don't know that that's a really holistic way to deal with, if you are in a major agricultural producing area, say like Southern California, and you have to pump gobs and gobs of chemicals into your water to make it safe to irrigate crops for human consumption. You're trading one poison for another, and you're also trading one risk, because I'd say that for most farmers, the riskiest thing we do, other than risking injury to limb and joints with our activities, is applying chemicals, right? I mean, those are the things that require special training. They're hazardous to our health, and if not applied correctly, they're hazardous to our crops, our customers, and our soil. So I'm not of a mind that, not figuring out ways to mitigate poor water quality by replacing it with risks associated with chemicals is a better bargain. Now, obviously, for some farms, that's the only choice they have. But okay, so with that, any questions?
Roger, I put in the chat a link to the Farmers Union resource page
Yep.
for further information about trainings also. I don't know if
Yep.
there's anything you might want to say about further resources, or if people are interested in attending trainings.
I do. And Suzette, if you could also, remember I sent you that thing from Mary Choate. God, what the heck do they call it? They're offering the free food safety training. So one, we have there's an outfit called the Produce Safety Alliance. They do, covered farms are required to take this training, and I think it's done in a day. In person, it was done in a day. I'm not sure what it's done online, or if it's over a certain number of days or what. But it's I'll show a prop here. You get this book, and it covers the rules section by section, and it really has just a lot of good information. I'm going to get to that question in a minute from Sherry. And this training is very modest, and we also we will fully cover the training for anyone that needs assistance, whether it's online or an in-person training. Right now, I think online's the only ones I've seen. Sherry, can you clarify your question? Pickles are on the high hat. You want to come off mute?
Hi.
Hi, Sherry.
Okay, so you can hear me now.
Yep.
So we just have a small farm stand and sell produce, but we also sell a few dozen jars of homemade pickles a year, which I just realized this year are on the high hazard list. But are you saying that we would qualify under a homestead exemption to be able to sell them without having the fancy kitchen and everything?
I well, I'm not totally familiar with the homestead exemption, but I think you would be. I mean, you have to follow, I think you got to follow the, the appropriate recipe,
Yes, right.
latest version of the ball book, I think is sort of the
Yes.
standard, right? Um, um, but yes, so you wouldn't, doing that, FDA is not going to, it's such a de minimis amount, right? They're not going to regulate you. And so they basically said, if you're currently operating under some existing exempt state or local exemption, proof of that. So if an inspector, and it's not going to happen in New Hampshire, but if an inspector came up to you at the market and said, how are you selling these? Where's your license? And you would point to your homestead exemption license as adequate proof. I think the FDA has also a form, but jams and jellies. I've seen plenty of folks at our market selling those things, and they've got I think there's like a little disclaimer label you put on. This is processed in a home kitchen, exempt from blah blah blah.
Okay, so
And a few
I'm
dozen
wondering
jars a
if-
year, you're clearly going to be, under the threshold.
yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering if New Hampshire law might be stricter than the FDA. Should I check into that, or does anybody know?
There is a great resource. It's from Amy Manzelli, had that her law firm
Yeah,
did that little article on homestead food production. Nikki, do you have that? Well, Sherry, if you want to drop your email in there, or just message me with your email, and I'll be happy to get you a copy of that article.
that sounds great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, any other questions? I'm hearing none.
Can you hear me?
I can hear
Okay.
you.
I'm just wondering if your presentation, might you be willing to let me post it on our website for people to look at?
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Well-
Can you remind us again, what's the, what will be the availability through NOFA for the workshop?
For the recording,
Yes, for the recording, yep.
we will have it up probably later this week, and everyone will have access to this one and all other workshops for 3 months.
Great.
And then oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I found that the link for oops, that is the wrong. This is the Jumpstart program. And that is not what I wanted it to do. But anyway, that gobbledygook there is the Jumpstart program. That's joint UNH extension and University of Maine extension for food safety training for farms. And this is really the best training you can get is individualized training and guidance the process, because it is, every situation is so unique. I'm sorry, now.
Oh, that is it.
Sue, can you explain the name of the device for irrigation that has changed? I'm not sure I understand.
Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
You had mentioned the change to the new water rules, one that was being proposed, and it said something about prior to harvest, if you're using irrigated water, it had to go through some sort of a filtration to decrease pathogen load. And I just missed the name of what that was.
Oh, no, it's there are filters you can use, but there's no specific product that that I mentioned. We talked about log die-off, which is from the time you last apply a water that may not be sterile, essentially, to the date of harvest. And so 4 days in the proposed rule. So if you have a river water or pond water that you may well want to, you're happy to swim in, and may not, may meet, swimming standards, EPA swimming standards, which is 124 coliform forming units, CFUs, which is the recreational water standard. You may be fine using that water on certain crops, but maybe you're thinking, do I really want to apply that to the salad mix the day of harvest? So just backing off 4 days gives you enough time that, sun, basically solar energy, is going to kill whatever pathogens are on there. Now, it's not a given. If you had high humidity, overcast, you may still have some pathogen load there. But they figure that in the proposed that 4 day waiting period was adequate for most crops. And of course, part of a risk assessment, and I guess one of the things that any of this food safety stuff is a risk assessment, right? We go out into the farm, we look for places where we have, what are we doing? Just, it's sort of taking that hard look at what you're doing and think about, and just imagine, what is the most vulnerable person I'm feeding, or that's a member of my CSA that's going to my farm stand? And am I comfortable with that most vulnerable person, my 89-year-old mother-in-law, my 76-year-old brother-in-law that's got terminal cancer, or the infant, next door? How good do I feel about that, putting that food in front of them? Because that's really, that's, like I said, that's who we have to be watching out for. Most of us are healthy as horses, and if you grew up like me, getting cow poop on you was just part of life. So, and it gave us fairly resilient systems. But, that's not, most of us aren't, not us, we're all,
Involved
in the soil, but a lot of people aren't. So.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
I actually have a follow-up question about at the actual post-harvest washing piece around glove wearing. As I understood it, if you are washing vegetables that are presumed that people would not necessarily wash again in their homes, such as a salad mix that you've triple washed, you should be wearing gloves to do those kinds of operations. But you don't need gloves for items that would likely be needed to be washed or peeled, just carrots or beets, etc. Is that true, or am I getting that wrong?
It's probably true that you heard it, but here's the thing. It's like, if you're wearing gloves is not required by the rule. It's not required in statute. It's not required by regulation, and it's not required by guidance. What is typically required is that, and if you're a covered farm, or you're a farm that's operating under a GAP program or some other third-party audited food safety program, if you have a policy about gloves, you're going to spell it out. Gloves are worn until they are soiled, and then they are removed. Hands are washed prior to putting on gloves. And when it comes to compliance, if you're really going to comply with whether it's your own self-structured food safety plan or a regulatory requirement, you're going to identify the risk, and here's how I'm mitigating that risk or avoiding that risk, and spelling out what your procedure is. So you can have a glove policy, but there is nothing that requires. Hand washing is probably the single most important thing we can do to improve food safety. No doubt about it. I mean, so wearing gloves, there's pros and cons to it. They can rip, they can break, they can, I mean, it's, they're not a panacea. But if you do use them, then craft up a little written policy about how, when, and why you use them, so that it's consistently applied.
Thank you. That was helpful.
You're welcome. Anything else? Well, I'm glad we had a little dialogue. That's good.
Roger, I Did you answer the question that was in the chat about the device for irrigation?
I did, I think.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I
Just
think
checking. Thank you.
I wasn't clear on what the log die-off was. And Sue, there are chemicals you can apply to your water, right? I'm not sure there are any that are EPA. And I talk about your water, to irrigation water, post-harvest water, you can apply like Sanidate and things like that to your post-harvest water. We don't on our farm. I find, again, to me, I'm swapping one risk for another. It's just as easy for our small level of production to drain the tank and add fresh water. Although I'll tell you, there was a couple times during last year's drought when I knew I was probably getting down to the bottom of my 400-foot well because we had sand spitting out the spigot, that I was thinking, oh, I wonder how much longer I could stretch this water. But you know, if you have adequate water, changing it is the best remedy as opposed to applying.
Yeah, we have a drilled well, so, and I get it tested every year for
Yep.
NOP reasons, so I'm
Yep.
not concerned. I just thought I missed something there. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. And even though testing is not required, you know, I think a general recommendation is for a drilled well, annual testing. For surface well, you know, dug well that's subject to runoff, right? Then you want to probably do it at least 3 times a year, and the same for, you know, ponds and rivers. So, or when it changes, when something changes, you know. We're in a small watershed areas, so typically, you know, it's not like California where they can get rain in the mountains or snow in the mountains and suddenly have, you know, high water levels in the desert in Imperial Valley or something. So, you know, we typically don't have to irrigate when we have a lot of rain. We have to be more cautious of those low water levels. That's because when we can start sucking the bottom on ponds and rivers, and that's where, you know, the pathogens are. So, and Extension has ample resources on, you know, best management practices around there. But this rule does sort of flip the script for us in that most times as farmers, we're most, like NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, will give you a lot of assistance in minimizing outflows from your farm, but not so much about improving the water quality coming onto your farm, right? But there are a lot of adjacencies in some of those programs. So if you have a pond and you want to improve the riparian area around that pond, you want to fence it back, you know, there are things you can, programs and services you can use, and we're happy to connect you on any of those.
I have a question about use of compost that's not certified organic. If you want to have your compost tested prior to application for things such as pathogens or herbicides, pesticides, does UNH Extension have programs that support that, or is there a different service that has to be used to get that information?
That's a good question, Sue. I don't know. Mary Choate, who, if you click on that big gobbledygook link I threw in there, would have probably the answer to that. I'm not sure if they do testing there. The thing on compost to comply with the rule is if you follow the NOP composting protocols, you would be in compliance with FSMA. It's still a good idea. I think it's a very safe idea, you know, to get it tested. But again, pathogens are everywhere, and it's we can't eliminate them because, you know, it's part of a biological farming system. These, you know, we're not sterilizing our soil, so these things are going to exist. It's how we mitigate them and reduce the risk of them contaminating our produce. So 45 days, I mean, you know, there are some crops where you may have, you know, fresh compost down and harvest that, you know, a kohlrabi or something prior. But again, you know, look at it all in as a system as opposed to in isolation. Testing for compost.
All right, perfect. So it's 1 o'clock. Would you like to add anything else before we close?
If questions about food safety, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm happy to answer them. We're happy to visit your farm you in any way we can. Almost as has a good and fruitful growing season. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So this concludes the workshop. Roger, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Our next session is this evening at 7 o'clock, and that's Farm to School Keeps Growing with panelists from schools around the state and New Hampshire Farm to School. And we will pop the links in the chat here in a moment. Make sure to check out our virtual exhibitor fair with 17 different exhibitors, including our conference bookstore hosted by Main Street Bookends. And when you order any books through Main Street Bookends and include NOFA-NH in the comments, 20% of proceeds will be donated back to NOFA New Hampshire. And for upcoming programs, mark your calendars for NOFA New Hampshire's Farm Bill listening session on February 17th. And our Feeding the Family Organic Gardening Series, which is 6 sessions bi-weekly from February 22nd to May 3rd. And finally, our bulk order program. You can save on farming and gardening supplies by ordering through NOFA. The order deadline is February 28th with pickup on March 19th and 20th in Andover, New Hampshire, Ware, and Rochester. And thank you again for joining us.